Snow fell sideways over Miller's Gulch, Montana Territory, in the winter of 1889. The wind came down off the ridge with a sound like a train that never arrived, and it pushed the drifts against the fronts of the stores until the doors barely opened. In the middle of the street, a woman was on her knees. Her shawl had slipped from one shoulder. Blood ran from a cut above her eyebrow and froze pink against her cheek before it reached her chin. In her arms she held a newborn wrapped in a gray blanket, and on either side of her, two girls pressed close, one gripping the back of her dress, the other standing in front of her mother like she meant to block a bullet with her own small body. A man stood over them. His coat was open despite the cold, as if the anger in him burned hot enough to keep him warm. "3 girls," he said. "And now this one makes 4 mouths and not one son." "Please," the woman said. "Not in front of them." He raised his hand. That was when a horse stopped at the edge of the street. Caleb Whitaker swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped moving. He did not run. He walked, boots breaking through the crust of old snow, until he stood close enough that the angry man had to turn to face him instead of the woman on the ground. "Get back on your horse," the man said. "This is my family. My business." Caleb looked at the woman. Then at the girl standing guard in front of her sisters. Then at the baby. "Not anymore," Caleb said. "You don't know me. I don't need to." The man's hand drifted toward his belt. Caleb's voice stayed even, the way a man's voice stays even when he has already decided what he is willing to do and is only waiting to see if it will be necessary. "Don't touch her again. If you want to see whether that woman gets off her knees today, stay with this story to the end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I would love to say hello and see how far this story has traveled." The man's fingers curled toward his belt. Caleb's did the same. For a moment neither of them moved, and the only sound was the wind and a baby beginning to cry. To understand how a woman ended up bleeding in the snow, and why a stranger was the only man in Miller's Gulch willing to step between her and her husband, the story has to go back 6 months. His name was Caleb Whitaker, and he was 39 years old. He ran a small cattle operation 4 miles outside of town, on land his father had cleared with an axe and a mule before Montana was anything but open country. The house was solid. The barn was solid. Everything about the place was built to last, except the 2 rooms at the back that Caleb kept shut, because his wife had once slept in one and his son had once slept in the other, and both of them had been gone 3 winters now, taken by a fever that came through the valley and did not ask who could afford to lose someone. Caleb did not talk about it. His hired hand, Josiah Reed, had worked the ranch alongside him for 11 years and still could not say for certain what Caleb's wife's voice had sounded like, only that Caleb sometimes stood at the fence line at dusk and looked toward the 2 shut doors of the house as if he expected them to open. "You ought to come to town more," Josiah told him one evening, forking hay into the trough. "Man can't live on cattle and quiet." "I do fine," Caleb said. "Fine ain't the same as living." Caleb didn't answer that. He had built a life that required nothing from anyone, and he had told himself for 3 years that this was a kind of peace. It was not peace. It was a man standing very still so that nothing else could be taken from him. In town, a different kind of quiet was being kept. Clara Whitmore lived on a small farm on the far side of Miller's Gulch with her husband, Hiram, and their 2 daughters, Eleanor, 9, and Sarah, 6. Clara was expecting a 3rd child that winter, and Hiram had told anyone who would listen that this one would be a boy, because he had decided it would be, as if wanting a thing hard enough could change what nature intended. It could not. The sex of a baby is set by the father's contribution at conception, not by anything the mother does or fails to do, and not by how badly anyone wishes for a son. Clara had been told this once by a traveling doctor and had never dared repeat it to Hiram. Hiram controlled the household money down to the coin. He decided which neighbors Clara could speak with and how long. When Eleanor was born, he had been short-tempered but tolerant. When Sarah came, something in him had curdled. He began speaking of his daughters the way other men spoke of a bad harvest, a thing that had happened to him rather than a family he had made. Eleanor noticed everything. She noticed the way her father's jaw tightened when Sarah laughed too loud, and the way her mother went quiet in a room the moment his boots sounded on the porch. Sarah noticed less, but she felt more, the way children do, flinching at raised voices before she understood the words behind them. Clara told herself it would be different once the new baby came. She was wrong.
Clara again.
The baby came in the first week of December, in the middle of a snowstorm that kept the doctor from reaching the farm in time. Clara delivered with only the midwife, Martha Boone, at her side. Martha, the sheriff's wife, had helped bring half the children in Miller's Gulch into the world, and she knew, the moment she wrapped the newborn and looked at Clara's face, that this household was not going to celebrate. "Another girl," Martha said gently, laying the baby against Clara's chest. "Healthy. Strong lungs on her." Clara held her daughter and wept, and for a long moment Martha could not tell if the tears were joy or dread. They were both. Hiram came in from the barn an hour later. He stood in the doorway and looked at the small bundle without moving closer. "A girl," he said. It was not a question. "Her name is Mabel," Clara said. Hiram said nothing else. He turned and walked back out into the cold, and Clara understood, in the silence of that turning, exactly how things would be from now on. They were worse than she expected. Hiram stopped speaking to Mabel entirely, as though a baby could be ignored into never having existed. He began taking Clara's savings, the small amount she had put aside from selling eggs and preserves at market, telling her a wife had no need for money of her own. He decided who she could visit and cut her visits shorter each month, until the only person she saw outside her own walls was Martha, and even that he begrudged. Eleanor began asking questions Clara did not know how to answer. "Why doesn't Papa like Mabel?" Eleanor asked one night, while Clara braided her hair by the stove. "He's tired," Clara said. "Grown men get tired. Sarah says he doesn't like any of us." Clara's hand stilled on her daughter's hair. "That isn't true." But even as she said it, she heard how thin it sounded, and Eleanor, at 9 years old, was already too smart to be comforted by words that didn't match what she'd seen with her own eyes. Clara began putting coins aside again, this time in a place Hiram would never think to look, inside the hollow leg of Mabel's cradle. It was not much. It was a beginning. She did not yet know what she was beginning, only that some instinct older than fear was telling her she would need it. "I will keep you safe," she whispered to her daughters, some nights, after they were asleep. "All 3 of you. I promise." She did not know yet how that promise would be tested, or how soon. There was another reason Hiram guarded the household money so tightly, one Clara did not fully understand until later. Her late father had left her a small inheritance, held in trust at the bank in Miller's Gulch, meant for her alone under the old paperwork he'd filed before he died. Hiram had spent 2 years trying to have his name added to that account, and each refusal from the bank had only sharpened his resentment. His anger at having no son and his hunger for control over Clara's inheritance had become tangled together in his mind, until he could no longer tell the difference between wanting an heir and wanting ownership of everything his wife touched. Clara did not speak of the trust to anyone, not even Martha, not yet. She only knew that Hiram's eyes went hard and calculating whenever the subject of her father came up, and that the coins she hid in Mabel's cradle were the only money in that house that truly belonged to her. It happened on a Tuesday in late January, though Clara would remember it for the rest of her life as simply the night. Hiram came home late, smelling of whiskey, and the first thing he did was ask where the egg money had gone. Clara told him she had spent it on flour and coal, which was true, though not the whole truth. He did not believe her. "You're hiding money from me," he said. "I'm not. Don't lie in my house." Eleanor stepped out from the hallway before Clara could answer. "Leave her alone." Hiram turned on his daughter with a look Clara had never seen him aim at a child before, and something in her went cold and clear all at once, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. "Go to your room," Clara told Eleanor, and for once, her voice left no room for argument. Hiram grabbed Clara's arm hard enough to bruise. She did not cry out, because Sarah was awake down the hall and she did not want her daughter to hear that sound. She simply looked at him, and something in that look, steady where it should have broken, seemed to make him angrier. He let go before it went further. He always let go before it went too far, which was its own kind of cruelty, because it meant Clara could never point to one night and say, that was the night everything changed. It was 100 small nights, each one shaving away a little more of who she used to be. But this night was different, because after Hiram fell asleep, Clara did not. She sat by the stove with Mabel against her chest and made a decision that had been building in her for 3 years without her fully knowing it. Before the sky lightened, she woke Eleanor and Sarah, dressed them in every layer of clothing they owned, and pried the coins loose from the hollow cradle leg. "Are we leaving?" Eleanor whispered. "Yes." "Where?" "Somewhere he can't reach us." They walked out into the cold 2 hours before dawn, Clara carrying Mabel, Sarah holding tight to Eleanor's coat, Eleanor watching the road behind them the whole way. It was 11 miles to Miller's Gulch. They made it as far as the edge of town before the sun came up, exhausted, frozen, and certain, for one brief and terrible hour, that they had escaped. They had not. Hiram found the empty cradle before sunrise. He did not need to guess where his wife had gone. There was only one road out of the valley that led anywhere, and he rode it hard, catching up to them just as they reached the edge of Miller's Gulch, cold and stumbling and almost within reach of help they didn't yet know they'd find. He dragged Clara off the boardwalk and into the street in front of half the town. "You don't run from me," he said. "You don't take my children and run." "They're my children too," Clara said. He struck her, and she went down into the snow, and this is the moment the story already told you about, the moment that opened this account. Eleanor stood in front of her sisters. Sarah cried. Mabel, wrapped tight against the cold, cried with her. And a rancher who had ridden into town for nothing more than a sack of feed got down off his horse because some things a man cannot ride past. "Don't touch her again," Caleb said. Hiram's hand went toward his belt. So did Caleb's. Sheriff Samuel Boone, Martha's husband, had been crossing the street toward the general store and broke into a run the moment he saw the two men squared off, but he was still 30 feet away, too far to stop anything by shouting. "Nobody's dying in my street today," Samuel called, closing the distance. "Both of you, hands where I can see them." Hiram lowered his hand first, but only because the sheriff had a badge and Caleb had a look that suggested badge or no badge, he would not have been the one to back down. Samuel stepped between them, and for a moment the whole street held its breath. "She's my wife," Hiram said. "That gives me the right." "It gives you nothing," Samuel said, "that lets you put a woman in the snow." Caleb knelt beside Clara, careful not to touch her without asking first, something in the gesture so different from everything she'd known that she looked up at him like she wasn't sure he was real. "Ma'am," he said. "You and your girls have somewhere safe to go tonight?" Clara shook her head, too raw to speak. "You do now, if you want it," Caleb said. "My ranch. 4 miles out. You don't owe me anything, and you're free to leave any time you choose. But nobody sleeps in the snow tonight, not on my account." Hiram started forward. Samuel's arm shot out and stopped him cold. "You'll answer for this in front of a judge, Whitmore, not in my street." Clara looked at her daughters. Eleanor gave the smallest nod, the kind a child gives when she has already decided to trust someone before the grown-ups have finished deciding for her. Sarah was still crying, but she reached for Caleb's offered hand without hesitation, the way children do when an adult finally feels safe. Clara took a breath that hurt her ribs and said the only word she had left. "Yes." Caleb's ranch sat quiet under the snow, a house built for a family that had stopped being one 3 winters ago. When Clara and her daughters stepped inside, the first thing she noticed was how clean it was, and how empty, the kind of empty that comes from a man scrubbing floors that no one but him will ever walk on. "You'll take the room at the end of the hall," Caleb told her. "I'll bunk in with Josiah out at the barn house. You don't have to give up your own room." "It isn't mine," Caleb said, and something in his voice closed the subject before Clara could ask what he meant. Eleanor watched all of this with the careful eyes of a child who had learned not to trust kindness until it proved itself over time. She did not thank Caleb. She did not smile at him. She simply watched, the way a person watches weather that might turn. Sarah had no such caution. Within a day she had found every horse on the property and given each one a name, and by the second day she was following Josiah around the barn asking questions faster than he could answer them. "Does Mr. Whitaker talk to his horses?" she asked. "When he thinks nobody's listening," Josiah said, grinning. "I heard that," Caleb called from the next stall, and Sarah laughed for the first time since they'd arrived, a small bright sound that made something in Caleb's chest loosen, just slightly, like a knot worked at for years finally giving an inch. Mabel would not go near him at all. She hid behind Clara's skirt whenever he entered a room, watching him with wide, wary eyes, and Caleb never pushed. He simply left a carved wooden horse on the kitchen table one morning, said nothing about it, and walked out to check the fence line. By evening, Mabel was holding it in both hands. Clara noticed these things. She noticed that Caleb never raised his voice, not once, not even when Sarah broke a jar or when Eleanor answered him with more sharpness than the moment called for. She noticed that he asked before he acted, in small ways, whether it was fine if he sat at the table or whether Clara wanted more coffee, as if her answer genuinely mattered to him and wasn't simply a courtesy. She was not used to being asked anything. One evening, after the girls were asleep, Clara found Caleb mending a bridle by lamplight at the kitchen table. She sat across from him, not because she had a reason, but because for the first time in years she wanted to. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "All of it. You don't know us." Caleb kept his eyes on the leather in his hands. "Man rides past a wrong like that, he isn't a man anymore. He's just a set of eyes that see nothing." "That's not really an answer." He looked up. "No," he admitted. "I suppose it isn't." The truth sat behind his eyes, unspoken and not yet ready to be spoken, and Clara did not push for it. She had learned, in her marriage, exactly what it cost to push a man for more than he was willing to give. She was starting to understand that Caleb was a different kind of man, one who might give more, in time, if she simply let him. Hiram had not disappeared. He had only gone quiet, and quiet, in a man like him, was never peace. It was planning. He could not simply ride onto Caleb's land and take back what he believed belonged to him, not with Sheriff Boone watching the road out of town. So he chose a slower weapon. He began talking. At the saloon, at the feed store, on the church steps, Hiram told anyone who would listen that his wife had abandoned him without cause, taking his children with her, and that the rancher out on the North Road had turned a decent woman's head and stolen a family that wasn't his to keep. Some of it was lies. Some of it was truth twisted just enough to look like something else. Word reached Caleb through Josiah, who came back from town one evening with his jaw set tight. "Folks are talking," Josiah said. "Some of them believe him. Let them talk. It ain't just talk, Caleb. Man like Hiram, when talk don't work, he tries something else." Caleb knew that. He had known at the moment he'd stepped between Hiram and Clara in the street, that a man who believed his family was property did not simply let property walk away. Samuel Boone rode out a few days later with a warning of his own. "He's been asking around about your ranch. Where the fence lines sit. How many men you've got working it. Let him ask. Caleb." Samuel's voice went firm. "A man like Hiram Whitmore doesn't forget what he thinks belongs to him. You do well to remember that before he's standing in your yard. That night, Clara found Caleb standing on the porch long after the girls were asleep, looking out at the dark tree line like he expected it to move. I'm afraid, she admitted, coming to stand beside him. Of Hiram? Of losing this. She gestured, small, at the house behind them, the warm light in the windows. I keep waiting for it to be taken away. It's easier to expect that than to hope for something else. You won't lose it, Caleb said. You can't promise that. No, he agreed. But I can promise I won't be the one who lets it happen. She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let herself believe, just a little, that a man's word might actually mean what it said. 3 nights later, the sound of horses came up the road in the dark, and Caleb was already reaching for his coat before the first knock ever landed on his door. There were 4 riders, though only one of them mattered. Hiram sat his horse at the edge of the yard with 2 hired men flanking him and a third holding back near the road, as if he'd wanted a show of force without quite having the nerve to bring a real one. Send her out, Hiram called. Caleb stepped off the porch, unarmed hand raised, the other close to his side. Get off my land. She's my wife. She's a woman, Caleb said. Not property. And she's not coming anywhere with you tonight. Inside, Clara had already gathered the girls into the back bedroom. Eleanor pressed against the door with her sisters behind her, listening to every word through the wall the way children always hear more than the adults think they do. Hiram dismounted. You think you can keep what's mine? They were never yours to keep, Caleb said. A wife isn't cattle, Whitmore. Neither are your daughters. Something in Hiram's face went past anger into something colder. He said things then about Caleb's dead wife and son, cruel and deliberate, the kind of words a man says when he wants another man to lose control of himself entirely. For one long second, Caleb's hand curled into a fist at his side, and every part of him wanted to close the distance between them and finish this with nothing but his hands. He didn't. That's not going to work on me, Caleb said, quiet and level, though it cost him everything to keep it that way. Hiram drew his revolver. Caleb's hand moved to his own a half-second behind, and for a moment the whole yard went still, snow falling silent between 2 men who had both already decided how far they were willing to go. The shot came from Hiram's gun, wild, striking the fence rail a foot from Caleb's shoulder. Before he could fire again, Samuel Boone's voice cut across the yard, the sheriff having ridden out the moment Josiah sent word to town. Drop it, Whitmore. Now. Hiram hesitated one heartbeat too long, and in that heartbeat Caleb closed the gap between them and drove his shoulder into Hiram's chest, taking them both down into the snow. Hiram fought like a man with nothing left to lose, landing 2 hard blows before Caleb pinned his arm and Samuel arrived to finish it, iron cuffs closing around Hiram's wrists in the cold. This isn't over, Hiram spat, still fighting the restraint. Caleb stood, breathing hard, and looked toward the house where 3 small faces had appeared at the window despite everything Clara had told them. It is for you, Caleb said. Samuel led Hiram away to stand trial for assault and for threatening a household with a weapon, and the sound of the horses fading down the road was the first sound in months that made the whole ranch feel quiet in a good way instead of a lonely one. Clara came out onto the porch, Mabel on her hip, Eleanor and Sarah pressed close on either side. She looked at Caleb standing in the trampled snow, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things don't need saying right away. Hiram's arrest did not end Clara's fear overnight. For weeks afterward she woke at every sound the old house made settling in the cold, certain each time that it was hooves on the road. Martha sat with her through the worst of those nights. Healing isn't a door you walk through once, Martha told her. It's a road. You'll have good days and days that feel like you haven't moved an inch. Both are still healing. Slowly, the fear loosened its grip. Clara began making decisions without asking permission from anyone, small ones at first, which fields to plant come spring, which fabric to buy for the girls' new dresses, and then larger ones. She told Caleb, plainly, that she wanted a say in how the ranch accounts were kept, not because she doubted him, but because she never again intended to be a woman who didn't know where her own family's money went. "Fair," Caleb said, and meant it, and pulled out a chair for her at the table where the ledger sat open. One evening in early spring, Caleb found her sitting on the porch steps and sat down beside her without being asked, which had become, over the months, its own quiet kind of intimacy. "You kept telling me I was safe here," Clara said. "You never once told me you were afraid I'd leave." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I am." "Why?" "Because I told myself after I lost my first family that I wasn't meant to have another. Easier to believe that than to open the door again and risk losing it twice." Clara took his hand, the first time she had reached for him first instead of the other way around. "Maybe you weren't given another family, Caleb. Maybe you found one. Those aren't the same thing, and I think the second one might be sturdier." Something in him that had been braced for 3 years finally let go. He turned toward her slowly, giving her every chance to pull away if she wanted to, and when she didn't, he kissed her, gentle at first and then not, the porch and the cold and the whole wide Montana sky forgotten around them. Later, long after the girls were asleep and the lamp had burned low, Clara stayed in the house at the end of the hall that had never, until that night, felt entirely like her own room, and for the first time in years she fell asleep without listening for footsteps that meant danger. Eleanor was the first of the girls to say it out loud, a few days later, catching Caleb by the barn while he mended a gate. "You're not just letting us stay here anymore, are you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Caleb said. "I'm not." Eleanor considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Good," she said. "Because I think this is where we live now." She was the last one Caleb had expected to say it first, and the fact that it was her, the daughter who had trusted him least in the beginning, made the words land harder than any speech could have. Not long after, Clara finally walked into the bank in Miller's Gulch and signed the papers that placed her father's trust firmly and only in her own name, free of any claim Hiram might have tried to make from a jail cell. The teller, an older man who had known her father, told her it was long past time, and Clara agreed. It was the first document she had ever signed as a woman making her own decision about her own money, and she kept a copy of it folded in the drawer beside her bed, not because she needed proof, but because she liked knowing it was there. She told Caleb about it that evening, and about Hiram's years of trying to claim it. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said only, "Good. That was always yours." No questions about the amount, no opinion on how she should spend it. Clara realized, sitting across from him, that this was exactly the kind of man Martha had once told her existed and that she had never quite believed in. Spring came to Miller's Gulch the way it always does in Montana, all at once, snow giving way to mud and then to green in the space of a few short weeks. Eleanor planted flowers along the porch rail. Sarah learned to ride a full-grown horse instead of just naming them, Caleb walking beside her with one hand on the bridle until the day she waved him off entirely. Mabel followed Caleb everywhere his boots went, holding 2 fingers of his hand, never once hiding from him again. Josiah took to remarking, more than once, that a house that used to be so quiet a man could hear his own thoughts had turned into the loudest place in the territory, full of questions and laughter and the sound of small feet on the stairs. "Might need another chair for the table," Josiah said one evening, watching all 5 of them crowd around a table built for 2. Caleb looked at him. Josiah smiled. "Just saying." Caleb built the chair himself that week, and then a second one, because by then he had already asked Clara to marry him, quietly, without a speech, simply taking her hand one evening and telling her that he did not want to spend one more season pretending she and the girls were guests in a house that had become, in every way that mattered, theirs. Clara said yes, standing right there in the yard, no ring yet, no ceremony planned, just 2 people who had found each other by accident and chosen each other on purpose. They married in early summer, on the porch where they'd first held hands, with Samuel and Martha Boone standing as witnesses and half the town of Miller's Gulch turning out afterward for a supper under the open sky. Eleanor wore flowers in her hair. Sarah talked through most of the ceremony until Josiah gently hushed her. Mabel sat on Caleb's hip the entire afternoon and would not be put down. That evening, once the guests were gone and the girls were finally asleep, Clara found Caleb on the porch, looking out over land that no longer felt like a place he was simply enduring. "You once told me I saved you and the girls that night in the snow," she said. "I did. I don't think that's quite right anymore." She sat beside him. "I think we walked into each other's lives at exactly the moment we each needed someone to remind us what living was for." Caleb took her hand. "I spent 3 years thinking I'd already had my one chance at a family and lost it. Turns out I hadn't lost the chance. I just hadn't met the rest of it yet." Hiram Whitmore was convicted that summer and sentenced to several years for assault, and the daughters he had once called a disappointment grew up strong, safe, and certain of something their father had never once managed to teach them, that they had never been a failure to begin with, not for a single day of their lives. A mother does not choose whether her child is born a son or a daughter, and no child, girl or boy, is ever a disappointment for simply being born. Real love, Clara came to understand, does not ask for obedience. It offers safety, and respect, and the freedom to become exactly who you already were underneath the fear. The house at the edge of Miller's Gulch that had once forgotten how to laugh spent the rest of its years remembering, morning after morning, for a very long time to come.